Yes, my name's Shazia Gleadall. I've been teaching RS for 13 years now. Really touching on partly what Professor James said, an interesting link there. His predecessor from the University of Chester actually trained me to be a teacher. It's a small world. My background is, I'm Pakistani background, Muslim, traditional Muslim family. I've always been really interested in religion, not just Islam. Particularly my interest is between the dialogue between Christianity and Islam. And one of the things I think we need to do as a Muslim community is more interfaith dialogue, which is massively lacking. And maybe learn a bit more from Christian communities to see what they've done and how that can help us as a community. We're just talking about particularly the teaching of RS. So I feel it's far too conservative. I don't think there's a surprise there. I think the teaching of Islam is really, really conservative. Islam is the only version of Islam that seems to be allowed. And we've got a lot of work to do there, kind of touching on what Professor James said. But also then I'm going to talk about, how we can relate the teaching of RS to us as a Muslim community. So a bit about my background, as I said, relatively conservative Pakistani family, but I was always interested in interfaith dialogue. And I think I had quite a questioning nature. I've always been that way. So a bit of a rebel. If I was told, well, you have to do this because that's what Muslims believe, I kind of fought against that. So I was always interested in how do I actually teach it. Okay, so a few things. Firstly, I just want to start off with how RS used to be taught. It's what I would call the confessional approach. So RS is all about preaching to children, and you got the preaching Christianity to children, and that was one model of teaching RE. And I get a lot of, in parents' meetings, I get a lot of parents are surprised at how popular RE is now, because they always say to me, oh, we just preached Christianity, and it's absolutely nothing like that now. It did move on, and then sort of 60s onwards, it got better, and it was meant in a good way, but I still think how it moved on had its own problems. So what I would call that is the phenomenological approach. The teaching of RS moved on to preaching to people, which I think it's good that it moved on, but it moved on to let's just talk about the human experiences of religion and make it all nice and palatable for everyone. So here's Christians and they go to a church, and look, Muslims are really similar, but they go to a mosque. And it was a dumbed down, I would say, version of religion, and I still think you get a lot of that being taught today. Where it's, look how similar we all are, and let's not talk about any differences, because that's all political and we don't want to go there. So let's just say we all share human experiences, we're all kind of the same. Now, I think that was meant in a good way, but it has its problems. It was sort of this very liberal approach, make it palatable to people. However, I still think that has its problems. I don't think it engages with any religion on its own right and respects those religions in their own right, going, look, actually there's massive differences between Christianity and Islam, or Hinduism and Islam, and that's okay. We don't all have to pretend we're all the same, even if we share a human experience. So I'd say how I teach, and certainly in my school, we teach what we call a critical realist approach. So we're quite openly, we teach the children, I teach secondary, obviously, we're able to take the religions on in their own right and look at truth claims the religions make. So not talking about, look, here's a mosque and here's a church and we're all the same and it's all nice. And actually saying, you know what, there's actually massively differing truth claims that certain religions make. So for example, just starting off for the younger children, so the year 7, we do what we call the puzzle of God. So here's the Christian view of God, Trinity. Here's the Islamic view of God, Tawheed, emphasis on that. And we actually look at the humanist approach, which I think not enough schools do. So we compare that with the humanist view of God, i.e. God doesn't exist, and why would they say that? And actually taking them head on. I hope it fosters more actual respect of the religions for children, because they accept that there's differences, not just saying, oh, it's all nice and everybody's the same, but actually saying we can respect them, but the big difference is here. And I would go beyond that. We call it the critical realist approach, because we actually challenge some of these views. I quite openly with my students say, what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? Let's compare the Trinity to how Muslims would view God. What do you think about that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And I think that's a far more interesting way of teaching RS, but also engaging, I think now if we relate it to the Muslim community, well, I think that's a good thing, because I think Muslims need to be more willing to actually debate, critically reflect on views, critically reflect on what it actually means to be a Muslim. I feel that was massively lacking for me growing up. I'm from Birmingham. It's a conservative Muslim community. There was only ever conservative Islam presented to me. So with my students, actually, we openly look at different views. Following on from what Professor James said, It has got better. I teach AQA, that's the exam board my school's with. Obviously, there's lots of others. We do look at Shia Islam. I touch upon Ahmadiyya Islam, and actually I live in Leamington. We have a significant Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I do mention them, even though generally it's not really taught. I think most people aren't really aware, certainly if they're not Muslim, about the Ahmadiyya community. And we look at the differences, and really I try and say, and my argument is, personally as a Muslim, I think we need to be way more open to accepting this idea of there's different Islams. I sometimes feel it's a bit of a cop-out when Muslims say there's only one Islam, Islam is perfect, and what they mean by that is don't question it, there's only one way you can be Muslim, and I have a massive fundamental problem with that. I also think it really turns away a lot of Muslims. I would class myself as fairly liberal, but this very conservative view, that's all I was exposed to, really put me off being Muslim when I was younger. In all honesty, made me disillusioned, thinking, well, maybe I don't fit in with this one Islam, which basically everything's a sin, is how it was presented to me, because you're not allowed to do anything, and certainly if you're a woman. And I want to challenge that and actually enthuse Muslim communities, encourage debate, encourage openness, because I think we're actually turning a lot of Muslims away by not being willing to debate key issues and just brushing them under the carpet. Just one example, so in my previous school, in Birmingham, all-boys school, very academic children, but conservative. I had a few Muslim boys ask me, obviously behind the scenes, talk to me about the fact that they thought they might be gay and how do they come across that, because their parents would certainly never accept it and they'd be disowned. I think that's massively damaging. Even if as Muslims we might draw boundaries, and fair enough, say there's certain guidelines on this. I don't think it's healthy to be saying to children, well, you can't be gay and there's no such thing as gay Muslims, because otherwise you're not Muslim. You're essentially turning people away who are teenagers, very validly questioning their identity, questioning how they feel, not sure where they fit in. So I think we've got a long way to go. So I hope certainly the way I teach it is to show there's differences, and actually talking about Islam itself, I'm quite critical let's pull apart some of these ideas which are classed as orthodox, which you're not really allowed to discuss, and I think you should be able to discuss that as a Muslim. So moving on from just how it's taught, in terms of how that affects sort of Muslim communities, this is where I think maybe the mosques have a lot more to do. We need to do far more interfaith dialogue, I'd say. Be open to look at what different communities are doing, and my particular interest is Christianity. I'm not saying it just has to stop with that, but let's say, dialogue with Christian communities who are very similar in many ways, but I think they're ahead of what we've gone through, and I'm more, I think, open to quite openly, discussing ways to be Christian, and that you can be a Christian and have different views. And I think that's the issue that's maybe lacking with Muslims. I feel within Christian communities, you can be a Methodist or you can be a Catholic or a Quaker, and they're more open to accepting differences, saying, well, I might disagree with you because I agree with the Catholic approach. I might disagree because I'm the Methodist approach. Muslims don't really do that. It's basically, here's a Sunni approach, largely, obviously there's a Shia as well, but overall, here's a Sunni approach. Everybody who doesn't fit into the Sunni orthodox box isn't a Muslim, and you're wrong, which I think is really damaging. So I would say, I don't feel what I'm saying is particularly radical, although unfortunately it is seen as radical. I just think it's a common sense approach. I think we need to be more willing to interpret the Islam, the Quran in different ways, which to me is authentic and actually going back to what Islam used to be like, which it isn't now. And I would say that this idea of you're not innovation is a sin. The hadith, this idea that if you innovate, it's wrong, has basically shut down any free thought within Islam. Because it's just, there's only one interpretation of the Quran that's allowed. And as the keynote speaker said earlier, this I've seen it in Birmingham quite a lot, this idea that the Sunnah is going back to exactly how the Prophet Muhammad lived. Now, to me, that's not a living, breathing religion, that's stagnation. You can look at the Prophet Muhammad and look at his ideals and his values, that's what it means to be Muslim. But there's so many Muslims that I've seen, what that means is, okay, so if you're a woman, you head to toe cover yourself, and if you're a man, you have to wear something, that exposes your ankles. And it's at that level still, when it should have moved way beyond that. We should be talking about values, about philosophy. And certainly in the teaching of it, I'd say, this is what I think with Christian communities, that's happening far more. I wish more Muslims would engage with philosophy. When we teach RE, especially A-level RE, I love it because it's philosophy and ethics. It's utilitarianism, Kant, Really interesting stuff that Muslims are massively lacking in. So I feel the way forward is interfaith dialogue. Events like this, in all honesty, I think it's brilliant that there's events like this where Muslims can openly go to different discussions and talk about things that are maybe a bit taboo in a way that certainly you wouldn't get in a mosque. I think engaging with other communities overall, I think accepting different interpretations of the Quran and accepting that I think that's exactly how it was supposed to be. I don't feel what I'm saying is radical, as I said. I feel actually that's what the Quran was supposed to be like. I think our idea of progress needs to maybe change, that just because the Prophet Muhammad taught in a certain way and what the Quran taught, that was absolutely radical for its time. I don't think as Muslims, we should think that means it should stop from 1400 years ago. It was progressive at its time. We shouldn't stop there. We should be able to use the ideals of the Quran to move it forward, rather than saying we have to stop exactly like it was the time of Prophet Muhammad and try and emulate that and live that way. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that engages with issues that we deal with now as a Muslim community, which then essentially, as I said, turns people away because they feel they don't fit into this little box of what it means to be Muslim. I think I've covered everything, so I'm a bit conscious of time. And I think just touching on this idea of extremism, there's a huge problem of that in our communities, and I think partly what I'm saying, I'm hoping that would combat that, because I think too many people now think to be religious or to be Muslim is, as I said, to go back to living very literally in a way that the Prophet Muhammad did. I think what we should be trying to infuse Muslims with, and people in general, is talking about how it's about sharing the values. Yeah, it's the values of what the Prophet Muhammad taught, rather than saying we need to dress exactly like he did if you're a man. And I feel that's what maybe the Christian community did that hundreds of years ago, and they've moved way beyond that. You know, the Christian, when I teach it, the Puritans, you've got the Puritan Christians, very religious, very maybe extreme is what we'd say today. Everything was a sin, couldn't dance, no gender, no genders mixing, a very literal interpretation of the Bible. I think generally Christian communities, certainly in the UK, have moved on from that. I mean, my students laugh when I say this, but today, if you spoke to a religious Christian, they wouldn't say to you, okay, Jesus is God, therefore we need to dress exactly like him, and because he had a beard, therefore we'll have a beard. You know, they'd look at you like you're mad, because Christians don't approach Jesus that way. Yet Muslims as a community think that's totally valid. There's many Muslims who say, right, to be religious is let's look at exactly what he wore and did, and we will just copy that. I think that's leading to stagnation in Islam and Muslim communities, because we're not actually engaging with interesting issues that we should be engaging with, and we're actually turning people away. And then I think, sorry, I'm a bit conscious of time, because it's almost up. So I'm hoping, I've said that there is hope. Speakers like Amina Wadud, feminist Muslim speaker, I think she's amazing. I wish there were more Muslim speakers like that, breathing life into it, allows you to see actually you can talk about more taboo subjects, that more feminist Muslims need to be acknowledged, and I think that's happening, and I think this will also appeal to more Muslims. Also people like Irshad Munji, Muslims for Progressive Values, I don't know if any of you have heard of that organisation. So it is happening. I don't want to end on a negative note. I think this is happening, but I don't think it's maybe happening fast enough. I think as an educator and as an RE teacher, I try and, when I teach RE, I make it a point for my students to have, like I said, a critical, realist approach where we can challenge ideas in religion. Religion isn't this subject that you can't challenge it and everything else you can, and religion has to be in this nice box where, no, you can't question anything. That's not realistic, and actually that's actually going to turn Muslims away because it's stifling. So that's the point I want to end with, but there is lots of hope. As I said, it is moving forward, but maybe a bit slowly. Thank you.